Dear colleagues, I am Oleh Petrechko, the head of the Department of World History at the Drohobych Ivan Franko State Pedagogical University. First of all, I would like to thank my German colleagues for making this meeting happen, to thank all of you for the interest in the topic. I would also like to personally thank Justina Dimke, who facilitated the organization of today's meeting. And now I will proceed to the presentation of my report. At one time, Heraclitus said that it is impossible to step twice into the same river. This is true by and large. However, history provides evidence of the fact that if something wrongful was once done in the past, then there is a high probability it will be repeated in the future, and even in a worse form. This is what we are dealing with when we talk about political persecution in ancient Rome and the Soviet Union. Damnatio memoriae is one of the most ancient ways of fighting political opponents, and at the same time, it is one of the most popular research topics in modern historiography. The Latin term memoria has much broader repercussions than its English counterpart memory, and encompass the notions of an individual's fame and greater reputation. The term damnatio memoriae is widely used today, although it was not used in the ancient Rome. It first appeared during the last third of the 17th century. The term is valid and convenient, but it should be applied with caution. It is hard to be sure what exactly it means. Abel Greenwich asserted that the whole question of damnatio memoriae is shrouded in great obscurity. Reference books trying to provide a clear, legit definition linked to majestas and perduellio. In modern historiography, there is no consensus towards the nature and the legal basis of damnatio memoriae. Abel Greenwich stated that it must be treated both as a general power of the Senate and as an appendix to its criminal jurisdiction. It was a consequence of perduellio, but it was a special appendix to each separate condemnation. Harriet Flower suggested that destroying a man's memory was also a time-honored Roman practice, which could be put into effect by families when circumstances dictated in order to assure their own survival. In her opinion, post-mortem disgrace contains two distinct tendencies in the individual penalties, namely the urge to remember the villain so that his fate may be a warning to others, and an equal or opposite tendency to forget him, to obliterate his name and career, and if he had never existed. Leszek Mrożewicz points out that in the political reality of the Roman Empire, damnatio memoriae became a weapon used by the emperor against the Senate, as well as it turned out to be used against the opposition. Charles Hedrick believes that there was no juridical concept of damnatio memoriae in ancient Rome, only a more or less conventional repertoire of penalties for repressing the memory of the public enemy. And then he continues. The damnatio memoriae is supposed to eradicate memory, but to recognize that there was such a technical procedure would be to acknowledge the repression and thereby allow the existence of those of whom it was illegitimate to speak. Marzena Dyakowska believes that the aim of damnatio memoriae was to perpetuate the memory of the offender as a perpetrator of a particularly heinous crime, and more precisely, crime against the Roman Empire, detrimental to the welfare of the whole community. Maciej Maciejowski defines damnatio memoriae as a constant part of public culture of memory. Krzysztof Krójcik, speaking about the time of Severan dynasty, emphasizes that the procedure of damnatio memoriae, as so as consecratio, has become a tool in the hands of the emperors that was used to lead the current political struggle and create warped historical memory. Daria Janiszewska believes that damnatio memoriae is evidence of authority instability. She consists in the following procedure of damnatio memoriae in the period of Septimus Severus' rule. Firstly, the princeps declares his political opponent a public enemy, hostis publicus. Then he obtains the Senate's official confirmation. And finally, all the authorities make a law opinion of condemned person. Lechosław Olszewski identifies both damnatio memoriae and consecratio as the important instruments of memory's institutionalizations. During the reign of Augustus, they were used to describe a new res publica, one that was essentially restored. Damnatio memoriae and consecratio thus became constitutive elements of the new political system Principate. Zuzanna Warchej notes that fact that the condemnation of the memory of senators was used by emperors only to put down individual senators, primarily for political offense, turning the imperial action into just one more example of political control. Danuta Okon examined material of Severan epoch and made the statement that the application of damnatio memoriae in relation to ordinary senators was more an exception than the rule. The condemnation of memory was already practiced by the despotic powers of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. In the middle of the second millennium BC, Thutmose III removed the Hatshepsut name from the inscriptions and destroyed her pictures. We are also seeing the damaged royal names and images in the tomb of Tutankhamun's successor Ai. It is hard to say, was the process of damnatio grounded in actual belief, or was the primary aim of the damnatio a political one? Both motives could have been present, but to what degree? This also happened with the images of the rulers in ancient Mesopotamia. Traces of deliberate damage are clearly visible on a fragment of a copper sculpture belonging to an unknown Akkadian ruler, which was found in Nineveh. Perhaps the image was damaged after robbery of Nineveh by the Medes and the Babylonians. The idea of condemnation of memory is suggested in the book of Ecclesiastes, presumably dating back to 3rd century BC. The text of the Vulgate contains the following lines: "It comes without meaning, it departs in darkness, and in darkness its name is shrouded. Sometimes it is difficult to distinguish the politically motivated prosecution of person's memory from ordinary steps taken to improve public welfare or deal with the consequence of the disaster. In 80 BC, Curia Hostilia, the meeting place of the Senate, was extended by Sulla's order. Later, the fire damaged the building. Julius Caesar began the construction of a new building on this very site. In Cassius Dio opinion, the real motive was a desire to remove Sulla's name and call the newly built Curia after Julius. Same way Sulla, having come to power, took steps to condemn the memory of political opponent Marius. According to Pliny the Elder, Sulla reminted a large number of Marius silver and gold coins. The prohibition extended to all images of Marius. Only in 69 BC, the images of Marius were shown by Gaius Julius Caesar during the funeral of Marius' wife, Julia. I believe we can agree by and large that damnatio memoriae means exactly what it looks like it would mean: damnation of memory. But we must keep in mind that for the Romans, the condemnation of memory had two aspects. The first aspect was punishment. The second one was an element of political propaganda in order to provide the correction of public opinion of Roman society as well as the next generation. We will that in any case of the damnation of memory, one or both of these dimensions were present in a certain combination. Ray Goschel, speaking of structural influences on collective memory, identifies three major dimensions: the mnemonic opportunity, an environment's present-day commemorative capacity, a past incident's ascribed significance, and finally, the moral valence of key characters at the time it occurred. It is, of course, no accident that the collective memory of a historical figure does not always correspond to his deeds. One can agree with the statement that the Romans were to a very large extent not in the habit of the storing memories, but of performing them. So, what exactly are we dealing with when we speak about the historical memory of the Romans? There's no reason to contradict Viera di Mentiva, who has noted that modern historiography focuses on the following types of memoria: gens memory practice, which is represented in the funeral ceremonies, monuments, tombstones, rites and festivals, historical topography, memorable places and landscapes, statues, and finally, Roman historiography. Probably all of these types of memory, to a greater or lesser extent, might be influenced by damnatio memoriae. The historical memory of the Soviet society was formed a little bit differently. We should talk about family's memory instead of gens memory. In all other parameters, the structure of the historical memory of the Soviet society was not that much different from the framework of the historical memory of the Romans. Condemnation of memory was repeatedly used already in the epoch of the Republic. Plutarch provides a detailed description of a terrible punishment that awaited the priestess of the goddess Vesta for the loss of virginity. The guilty was not just condemned to a horrible death, but was also deprived of a proper funeral ceremony. The name of the punished had to be removed from the official records. Indeed, in the inscription of AD 364, the Vestal's name was erased. We can understand only the first and last letters K and heir. There was not an established template on how to impose the penalty in such cases at the epoch of the Republic. Application of damnatio memoriae during the epoch of the Principate became an important part of the political propaganda of the regime, which promoted ideological grounding of the empire. In the days of the empire, condemnation of memory was often used against political opponents. So in ancient Rome, there were legal grounds for this type of punishment, imposed according to the specific procedure. The decision to condemn the memory was formally approved by the Senate, but it was really dependent on the will of the ruling emperor. Emperor decided whether the resolution of the Senate was final. In the Soviet Union, the condemnation of memory was not a punishment that was imposed by law directly, but it was used to the so-called enemies of the people. There is an assumption that the basis for condemnation of memory was not the law, but mos maiorum. Cecil Hilton claims that the decision of the Senate on condemnation of memory was imposed as an additional punishment for someone who had been convicted of a serious crime, particularly under the Lex Julia. In fact, there is no sufficient evidence to believe that the Lex Julia involved condemnation of memory. John Bodel concludes that condemnation of memory based itself on both the public law and mos maiorum. There's no information about the Senate's decision on damnatio memoriae of Brutus and Cassius. However, condemnation of memory was applied to them as well. Octavian, seeing a bronze statue of Brutus in Mediolan in Gallia, criticized the local magistrates for harboring his enemy, although later he turned it into a joke. Condemnation of memory of Brutus and Cassius found its display in prohibition to use their images at the funeral of Junia, the wife of Gaius Cassius and sister of Brutus. In modern historiography, there is no consensus as to whether the decision of the Senate had to the force of a law and whether it was obligatory for the members of the genus of the convicted. Carsten Lamb states that there was no formal ban to mention Antony. In John Bodel's opinion, the Senate had no right to give orders on the issues of tribal rituals and probably was reluctant to interfere in these matters. Danuta Ocon says that the Senate was formally a single body, authorized to decide the issues of damnatio memoriae. Nevertheless, in the epoch of Principate, the Senate's decision required approbation of the princeps. Marzena Diakowska believes that discussed sanction that was referred to in the sources as memoria damnata, memoriam accusare, defuncti, memoriam abolere, required a special decision of the Senate or the Emperor. Eric Warner forcefully expresses that in some cases the historical sources are unambiguous about the official senatorial sanctions, but in other cases, senatorial sanctions can be inferred. But the Caligula's case shows that condemnation of memory could have been imposed on individuals even without a formal decision of the Senate. Emperor Claudius did not allow the Senate to adopt a decision on damnatio memoriae of Caligula. But without Senate decision, at the order of Claudius, all the images of Gaius were removed overnight. His name was removed from oath and prayers, as it was done early with the name of the late Emperor Tiberius. As for the Emperor Tiberius, there also was no official Senate's decision about the condemnation of his memory. However, it is quite possible that information about some decisions of the Senate has not been preserved. For example, there are no direct proofs of the Senate decision on damnatio memoriae of Sianes, but he was executed and his images were destroyed. In addition, mourning for Sianes was forbidden. The Senate adopted the decision about condemnation of Antony's memory in the time interval between the Battle of Action and the death of Antony. But Octavian allowed Cleopatra to bury Antony with full honors, knowing about the decision of the Senate, but ignoring it. Later, Octavian either cancelled Antony's damnatio memoriae or adjusted the Senate decision on the matter. Augustus' policy towards memory of Antony lay not in denying his past action, but rather in the new interpretation of the motive and consequences of his action. In the USSR, there was also no term condemnation of memory, but there was punishment of this kind. According to the Constitution of 1936, the person had almost all possible freedoms, and the concept of supreme supervision over the exact implementation of laws was introduced into it. But from the 1st of December 1934, not only the lawyer, not only the prosecutor, but also the accused were not included in the terrorist trial. As you can see, both in the Roman Empire and in the Soviet Union, the fate of the accused wasn't always decided solely on the basis of the law. The Senate's decision to announce the date of convicted person's birth to be unholy or accursed. In particular, such punishment was imposed on Mark Antony. The date of his birth, January 14, was announced unholy, dies vitiosus. Georg Rathke notes that this is our first and last encounter with the concept dies vitiosus, and after the reign of Emperor Claudius, January 14 was Fastus. This kind of punishment was not applied in the USSR. Yet another form of condemnation of memory in ancient Rome was that relatives were prohibited from using the name of the convict person. In the 4th century BC, after Marcus Manius Capitolinus was sentenced to death, the gens Mannia was forbidden to take praenomen Marcus. After the conviction of Mark Antony, the Senate decreed that the representatives of gens Antonia were forbidden to take praenomen Marcus. In 16 BC, Marcus Scribonius Libon Drusus was accused of plotting a coup. All his kinsfolk dishonorably deserted him as if he was not convicted but executed. Drusus did away with himself. Senate banned the use of his image in burial ceremonies. The gens Scribonia was forbidden to take cognomen Drusus. Libon Drusus' property was divided between his accusers. In 20 AD, Emperor Tiberius transferred to the Senate the case of the Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, who was accused of some serious crimes. Piso committed suicide, not waiting for the verdict. Steps taken against Piso were aimed more at his name rather than his property and can be characterized as damnatio memoriae. All 6 of the penalties imposed by the Senate on Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso after his suicide were actually part of his damnatio memoriae. His eldest son was forced to change the name Gnaeus to Lucius. Piso's name was not removed from Fas only to the intervention of the Emperor Tiberius, who significantly mitigated sentence made by the Senate after the peasant's death. The text of the Senate's resolution was preserved, known today as the Senatus Consultum de Nies Pisone Patre, which fully confirms and supplements the information given by Tacitus. Some forms of condemnation of memory practiced in ancient Rome were not used in the Soviet Union, in particular the destruction of houses of those whose memory had to be condemned. For example, there were destroyed houses of Tarquinius Superbus and Marcus Manius Capitolinus. Marcus Manius Capitolinus was sentenced to death. Apart from that, measures were taken for condemnation of his memory. Cassius Dio reports that Capitolinus's house was razed, his wealth was confiscated, and his name and his likeness were erased and destroyed. There was a decree that no patrician should dwell upon the citadel, because Capitolinus had his house there, and no one of the Manni should be called Marcus. Dio Cassius claims that Marcus Manius Capitolinus' name was erased from all inscriptions. Today, it is believed that Dio is probably indulging in an anachronistical projection here, though his statement does provide evidence for the practice in the 3rd century AD. The earliest certain examples of the penalty date to the late Republic, but Dio Cassius' statements are also confirmed by testimony of Livy and Plutarch. A home for the Romans was something more than a dwelling means today. There was a fire in the house, focus, where ritual libation were done. According to the Roman beliefs, gods of the hearth and home, Lares and Penates, control everyday life's affairs. Therefore, the destruction of the house was a cruel punishment for the whole family of the punished. A house, domus, was the center of the family's memory. Its destruction was an effective condemnation of the memory. In the 58th year BC, after the Cicero's expulsion from Rome, his country houses were burned, as well as his house in Rome. By the time of Dio, damnatio memoriae did not include the destruction of the house of the banished. Important parts of damnatio memoriae in ancient Rome were some restrictions imposed at the funeral of the convicted person, as well as the funeral of his cognates and agnates. Such punishment was imposed on Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, Marcus Scribonius Drusus, etc. In particular, women were forbidden to mourn the death of the convicted, as the custom would have expected it. Moreover, it could even have been forbidden to bury the bodies of convicts. It was this form of punishment that was imposed on the Roman soldiers who were guilty of an offense against the residents of Rhegium. The same punishment was imposed on Gaius Gracchus and his supporters. 3,000 dead bodies were thrown into the Tiber, and their property was confiscated. Their wives were not allowed to mourn their husbands. After the suppression of the Catalan rebellion, it was forbidden to hold a proper burial ritual for the body of Publius Lentulus, the stepfather of Mark Antony. The future triumvir accused Cicero of this ban. In the Soviet Union, usually not only there was no proper burial funeral for the condemned enemy of the people, but the relatives did not even know the exact date of his death, the exact burial place. Another ban in Rome specified that the condemned person's images were forbidden during the burial ceremonies of all who belonged to convict's family by a blood relationship or through a marriage. In the Soviet Union, this kind of punishment was not applied because the funeral ceremony was different. As in contemporary countries, the last respect to the deceased persons were paid only by their living relatives. without using images of their ancestors. In ancient Rome, as in the Soviet Union, the condemnation of memory provided for the removal of all images of convict. In the 30th year BC, all images of Mark Antony were removed. We can conjecture that metal sculptures and portraits of Antony could have been remelted for the further use. It is possible that, that this metal was used to produce some of the Octavian sculptures. In the 24th year BC, Gaius Silius was sentenced under the law about the criminal license majestatis. He committed suicide, not waiting for the verdict. The punishment, apart from property confiscation, involved condemnation of memory. His images had to be destroyed by order of the Senate. Contrary to the Senate's decision, Gaius Silius' images were stored in the lobby vestibulum of his son's home, who also had the name Gaius Silius. In the epoch of Principe, the usage of the imperial palimpsest image spread. Dale Kinney notes, in the 1st century, imperial palimpsest portraits were nearly always made from images of previous emperors whose memory had been damned. Hence, the many heads of Nero refashioned into Vespasian, Domitian, Titus, and portraits of Domitian recycled for Nerva. Nero's Colossus changed the head several times, and at least once was modified by Nero's successors into a statue of the sun god Sol. On the well-known frieze, the head of the Emperor Domitian was probably resculpted to depict the next emperor Nerva. Gian Polini argues that the portraits of the Emperor Vespasian, one in the Cleveland Museum of Art and the other in the Walters Art Gallery, both were reworked from likenesses of Nero. Such substitutions of the sculpture's head was a cheap way for the efficient Romans' sake to get a statue of the reigning emperor. Some portraits undergone more than one recutting. We must admit that primary motivation for reusing a previously carved piece of marble was economic reason. Karl Galinsky emphasized that reuse and recycling of portraits in the imperial times were a mass phenomenon, but the frequency of recurring portraits of bad emperors into those of good ones drops off sharply after its heyday in the 1st century AD. There were lots and lots of those examples in ancient Rome, and even more of them were in the Soviet Union. The cases when political opponents were removed from pictures constitute a vivid example of the condemnation of memory in the Soviet Union. The most typical cases of damnatio memoriae of that kind during Stalin's period were selected by David King in his book. May 1920. Vladimir Lenin had a speech at a mass rally in front of the Bolshoi Theater. Leon Trotsky, Lev Kameny were photographed on the steps of the rostrum from which Lenin spoke. But in 1933, when Isaac Brodsky painted his picture from this photograph, neither Trotsky nor Kamenev were in it. On July 23, 1920, in Smolensk, there was established the Provisional Polish Revolutionary Committee, more commonly known by its Russian acronym Polrevkom. 11 members of the committee were represented in the photo from early August 1920. Most of them were subsequently repressed, and their images have been removed from the photo. There were only 3 persons in the final version of the photo. Sometimes the enemy of the people was not removed from the photograph completely. They could only obscure his face. When it came to the damnatio memoriae in ancient Rome, it was mentioned that Gaius Silius was sentenced to this type of punishment, but his image was stored in his son's home, and no one was held to account for that very crime. In the Soviet Union, the punishment for this kind of crime was more inevitable. For example, Sam Krisin was sentenced to 10 years. The main piece of evidence against him was the portrait of Alexei Ivanovich Rykov, found during the search of his room. It was really about the fact that Alexei Rykov was arrested by that time, and his images had to be vanished. Images of all repressed old revolutionaries were to be destroyed. Leon Trotsky, Nikolai Yezhov, etc. There were, however, also instances of difficult decisions to act properly with the image of the enemy of the people. But first, let's go back to ancient Rome for a while. In 310, Maximian Herculius attempted a coup against Constantine, for which he paid with his life. His memory was cursed, which entailed the destruction of the inscriptions with his name and his images. Many portraits of Maximian depicted him together with Diocletian, which is why images of both were destroyed. And let's return to the Soviet Union again. In the then Museum of Leningrad Defense, there was a painting entitled Zhdanov and Kuznetsov at the direct line during the negotiations with Moscow. This is only a photo of Zhdanov and Kuznetsov. Alexei Kuznetsov was a high-level party functionary who proved himself well in Leningrad during the Second World War. He dressed his young son in military uniform, as Germanicus once clothed his son Gaius. But in 1949, Kuznetsov was arrested, sentenced to death, and executed. So he was the enemy of the people, but was portrayed beside his friend Zhdanov, who died in 1948, and maybe because of this he remained a hero. At first, the museum workers were confused, but then they showed ingenuity. The figure of Kuznetsov was obscured and window was drawn instead. Nevertheless, soon the museum was closed. A large number of its exhibits were destroyed. In June 1953, Lavrenti Beria was arrested, and a few months later he was executed. All his portraits were seized, destroyed, torn from the books. The books in which Beria was praised were also seized from libraries and stores. In other books, pages with quotations of Beria's speeches should have been deleted. It was not allowed to mention his name. The portrait of Beria, which hung on one of the Russian stadium, among other portraits of the leaders, was removed off right during the soccer game in front of hundreds of surprised football fans. As in ancient Rome, also in the Soviet Union, the condemnation of memory provided for the abolition of all honors that had been previously granted to the convict. All honors that had been previously imposed on the convicted Mark Antony, Nestor Piso, and many other Roman high-ranking personalities were voided. In the Soviet Union, the law made provision for the deprivation of government awards of convict persons. On June 11, 1937, 8 highest Soviet military commanders, including Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, were sentenced to death by shooting and deprived of military ranks and government awards. Another form of condemnation of memory is associated with the written word. The cancellation of the Acta Diurna can be regarded as the first example of political censorship in Imperial Rome. It was Augustus who decided that Acta Senatus should not be published. The senators still could afford free thinking, but it was not necessary for the Roman people to know about this. An illustration of Antony's name Sentia might be Res Gesta Divi Augusti. It was probably written in 13 AD. In the 24th paragraphs, Augustus says that being a winner, he replaced the ornaments which his antagonist pillaged from the temples in all the cities of the province of Asia. It was Antony who robbed the temples of Asia and handed the loot to Cleopatra. Same way, Augustus does not mention the names of Brutus and Cassius when he speaks about them in the second chapter, those who slew my father. Patricia Southern claims that Nicholas Damascus hardly at all mentions Antony in his account of events before and after the assassination of Caesar. Damnatio memoriae of Antony also took the form of destruction of anonymous poems and epigrams, as well as demolition of literary works of some authors who supported Antony. The letters which were found in Antony's boxes were also banned, with the exception of some of them. There's no doubt that Octavian saved only letters which he could use against the Antony's memory. But some documents against Octavian managed to survive, and some authors had direct or indirect knowledge of such pamphlets and letters. The trial against Titus Labienus, who had criticized Augustus in his historical work, took place between 6th and 8th AD. Frederick Kramer states that Titus Labienus was the first Roman martyr in the cause of freedom of speech and writing. His work was burned by decree of the Senate. In 25, Aulus Cremutius Cordus was brought to trial and committed suicide. He praised Brutus and Cassius in his work. His books, according to the Senate's decision, were banned. It shows that damnatio memoriae applied not only to Brutus and Cassius, but to Aulus Cremutius Cordus himself. In 34 AD, Marcus Aemilius Scaurus' drama Aetrius was suppressed because of the hints contained in it on the Emperor Tiberius. During the reign of Domitian, Aurelianus Rusticus and Herennius Senecio were condemned to death for praising Paetus Thrasea and Priscus Helvidius. Their books were banned by the decision of the Senate. In Russia, the issue of political censorship had arisen even before the foundation of the Soviet Union. In 1919, 291 employees worked in the Petrograd branch of military censorship. In June 1922, the censorship agency was established under the name Main Administration for Literary and Publishing Affairs, commonly known by its Russian acronym GLAVLIT. GLAVLIT was entrusted with the task of censorship of all the works intended for publication, even of musical notes. In 1947, the agency had 6,453 employees. All books had been banned since the arrest of their authors. Such was the case of the Leningrad University professor Pavel Medvedev. The reason for the prohibition and destruction of any book could be references made in the text to the person who was convicted as the enemy of the people. In February 1940, Vladimir Bonch-Bruyevich's book on the death and funeral of Vladimir Lenin was banned because the text referred positively to Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin, who had been condemned as enemies of the people. The book could have been removed from the libraries even if it was not included in the official censorial list. In the Roman Empire, the change of the emperor could lead to the reversal of a previous decision on the condemnation of memory and the adoption of a new one. Antony's memory and reputation did undergo rehabilitation. This process began under the Augustus rule, continued under Caligula and Claudius. Both of them were related by blood to Antony. Attitude to the former emperor's memory could change with the appearance of the next ruler. The temple of Emperor Claudius was destroyed by Nero and rebuilt later by Vespasian. Otho allowed to restore the images and statues of Nero and even added Nero's name to his own. On the other hand, Otho has taken several measures to condemn Galba's memory. Public buildings, themi, bridges, food warehouse, etc., that were built by emperors who were later sentenced to damnatio memoriae, with few exceptions, continued to operate until were destroyed by fire or time. The main factor that protected them was their practical importance. Marshall aptly described the situation. What is worse than Nero? What is better than Nero's tyranny? Those arches that had no practical value were destroyed. They had only propaganda functions. Those arches that were part of aqueducts were protected, maintained in good condition. There exists a debatable opinion that Commodus damnatio memoriae was never reversed. Nevertheless, the memory of Commodus was rehabilitated as well as was Antony's memory from the very beginning of Principate. It was inevitable as soon as Septimus Severus decided to be the son of Emperor Marcus Aurelius and the brother of Commodus. Further to this, Severus bestowed divine honors upon the Commodus and established him a priest. A new set of coins was issued after the deification of Commodus. The Commodus case shows that damnatio memoriae was not irreversible. It depended upon the ruling emperor's whim whether the Senate's decision was final. Abolition of the Senate's decision meant deep humiliation, and it also showed its weakness. Exactly the same thing was a usual practice in the USSR. Many people who had been unjustly repressed in the time of Stalin's rule were rehabilitated by the courts after his death. Moreover, Stalin himself became the object of condemnation of memory. You can see it on the screen. There is Stalin, there is no Stalin. Stalin, no Stalin. To sum up, condemnation of memory was one of the components of political repression in ancient Rome as well as in the Soviet Union. Both in the Roman Empire and in the Soviet Union, the fate of the accused wasn't always decided solely on the basis of the law. Thank you very much.